All right, Lee, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
What's going on? Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. I've followed your work for a long time. I mean, even before I was, really involved as someone who was arrogant enough to produce my own podcast. I was kind of insinuated in the 2A space, and so I've been reading it for a long time. And then obviously this episode has been in the works for, shall we say, an embarrassingly long amount of time.
Yeah,
I have an inability to remember time zones, and so I think we fucked something up, or I did. But I'm glad to have you on, man.
yeah, absolutely.
So hypothetically, of course, there might be someone in the audience who isn't familiar with who you are or what you do. But could you describe, just generally speaking, your background and what you do on the internet?
Yeah, so most people will probably know me from Twitter. I'm just kind of a random shit poster. I also operate a newsletter called the In Block Press newsletter. That is a little bit more serious in nature, and it focuses on guns, 3D printing, politics, things in that realm. Uh, so that goes out, maybe once a week or so, and yeah, the rest of the time you can see me on Twitter, just you know, just posting random things that would get you expelled from society, I guess.
I sort of had that realization as I was sitting waiting for a meeting with a client, and was just a few fractions of a second away from playing a video of and you probably know exactly which video I'm talking about, but of an African American gentleman just getting absolutely ventilated for
Yeah,
pointing a gun at a police officer, and I had this instant realization: was like, if this came on with the audio, I would look like an absolute psychopath. And so I did
yeah.
what any normal poster would do and just turn the volume down and then watch the video.
Well,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah, I mean there is something to the meme of shaking my head so that everyone knows I disagree with it. Because it's like impossible to open Twitter in a public space at this point because yeah, it's just a disaster waiting to happen.
So your newsletter covers a lot of 2A law, right? It's primarily centered on that issue. And there have been a lot of significant developments recently. Obviously, the one that I think affects the majority of people is the pistol brace case. There's also been a development with bump stocks, and then something as well with kind of debanking. And so we have an international audience here. So if you could you explain the core controversy at the root of this pistol brace case?
Yeah, yeah. So most of this is one of those annoying cases that has kind of bounced around in the judicial system for years back and forth, and for the international audience in the United States, most most gun ownership at the federal level is regulated by what's called the Gun Control Act, uh, which is your everyday guns, handguns, standard rifles, things like that. And then within Title II, there's what's called the National Firearms Act, which dates all the way back to 1934. And this regulates firearms that need to be federally registered. So in America, there are certain characteristics that a firearm can have that require it to be registered on what's called the NFRTR. Um, and that's maintained by the DOJ, and that's a database of any machine gun, short-barreled rifle, short-barreled shotgun, AOW, etc., destructive device, what have you. And typically, a rifle that has a barrel length of less than 16 inches ends up, if it has a traditional stock on it, it's considered what's called a short-barreled rifle. There's nothing special about these rifles other than the fact that the barrel is slightly shorter than the arbitrarily defined 16-inch limit. They don't, they're no more or less deadly. They don't do anything extra evil or anything like that. Uh, so it's kind of this annoying thing where if you want to have a rifle that has like maybe like a 10.3, 10.5 inch upper receiver on it, and you want to use a standard rifle stock, you have to file an application with the ATF, and you have to pay a $200 tax. It's a one-time fee. They give you a stamp. It's a literal stamp that they will issue to you uh, for the privilege of owning that firearm. Now, traditionally, this has been a process that takes a considerable amount of time and is kind of frustrating to deal with. It has improved in recent years, especially lately. Um, but up until a certain point, if you wanted to have an SBR, you had your components, you filed your application with the ATF, you had to send them, a passport photo, a fingerprint card, is a whole application you have to fill out. You have to notify your local chief law enforcement officer, and then you would wait for like between 8 months and like 18 months for them to either approve it or to kick it back with no action. So, or to just reject it on like a NICS denial or something like that. And so these guns are cool. Like a SBR looks cool, and they're favored for any number of reasons. And so everybody kind of wants one. And at some point, a company called SB Tactical produced what we all know as a pistol brace, which is originally designed, and I will say ostensibly designed to allow a firearm to be, basically instead of a stock going on your shoulder, you would have a semi-hollow structure on the back that was secured with Velcro that you would wrap around your forearm, and allowed you to fire a rifle caliber weapon like an AR pattern, carbine with maybe a 10.3, 10.5 inch barrel with this pistol brace on the back of it. And aesthetically, it looks very similar to an SBR, but by the letter of the law, if you put a stock on it, it's an SBR, and if you put a pistol brace on it, it becomes a question for the ATF of whether or not you have basically altered the design of the weapon to allow it to be fired from your shoulder. And so this is a very, like, people have to understand that the ATF, the constant antagonism here is not so much a Second Amendment issue as it is a procedural issue, where they will take whatever they can get away with. Like, they will arbitrarily pass rules with the hopes that it'll stick in the court system after years of fighting and considerable money is being put into the efforts. So SB Tactical developed a pistol brace. The ATF reviews these through what's called a firearms technology branch, where you can send this thing off and say, hey, is this kosher with you guys? And they will evaluate it, and they'll say, okay, yes, this is fine, or they will say this would fundamentally alter this weapon, and we would view this as an SBR. Having an NFA item that is unregistered is a serious federal crime, and so it's one of those things where if your barrel is maybe an inch too short, or your stock maybe isn't the right stock, potentially, and especially if you're like a political enemy, you could face very serious federal prosecution from this. People go to jail for NFA violations, and so the stakes are really, really high over a topic that is relatively semantic and ultimately kind of silly, because it's never a question of whether the person who has this firearm is lawfully eligible to own a firearm. Like, you can have someone who obtains a firearm totally legally, passes the background check, complies with every state and local and federal law, and then if they put the wrong accessory on that firearm, suddenly they're looking at up to 10 years of jail time. So it's this very kind of bullshit area in the gun industry and gun enthusiasm and things like this. And so this pistol brace, when it came out, the ATF looked at it and they said, okay, well, this is fine. And all of a sudden, everybody had a pistol brace on an AR with like a 7.5, 10.5, 13 something inch barrel. And this was very popular for a number of years. And the ATF, a few years later, they reversed themselves. And then after that, they affirmed several more times that the pistol braces were fine. Okay, so in 2012, 14, 15, and 2017, and 2020, they were all fine. And then in 2021, they did a 180 and they said, okay, this the Biden administration came in and said, hey, this is not okay. These actually do change this into a weapon that's designed to be fired from the shoulder, and so we're going to call these SBRs, and we're going to say that your choices are to throw your pistol brace in the trash, turn it in to law enforcement, or go to jail, or register your firearm with the federal government with like a one-time waiver of this $200 fee, basically like an amnesty. And this was obviously, this is a very unpopular policy because it's purely a way for the Biden administration, and this was an attempt. This has since been vacated, so that the law is not in effect. But at the time, this was an effort by the Biden administration to punish an unknown number, but it's estimated to be in the millions of lawful gun owners. And it was especially like a poke in the eye because you have to understand that everyone who owns a pistol brace specifically bought it because it was like expressly allowed, right? This is one of those things that the ATF was like, yep, you're good. You can have this. And everyone was like, are you sure? And they said, yep, yeah, absolutely. You're all good, man. Thanks for asking. And so there's, millions of people who probably bought this during like COVID, the fentanyl riots, and any time of political unrest or uncertainty, who just first time gun owners go into gun stores, buy the first thing they see on the wall because they're in a panic, go home, and then the law changes and like they don't even know that potentially they could be looking at, federal time for this. And fortunately, it was defeated in courts because at face value, it's silly. Like it's ridiculous to have a federal administrative body say something is fine over and over and over again, and then overnight say actually it's not fine now, and you're going to go to jail if you don't listen. And so it recently went away. The federal judge in Texas vacated the decision, and so now it's fine, and everyone can show their pistol braces on Instagram again and pretend like they ever put them away to begin with.
I think it's difficult for people to understand who aren't connected to, that hobby or that culture, to understand the kind of combative relationship between the ATF and gun owners. I would say I can't think of another, agency that has that much of a negative reaction, but that's probably an overstatement. I'm probably just not thinking hard enough. How would you describe that relationship?
It's very bad faith. The ATF, even obviously, the ATF is they didn't make a lot of friends in the Waco incident and that type of thing. I mean, this type of federal persecution of lawful gun owners. I mean, you look at this again with Waco. You look at this with the Weaver family. These are extreme examples where they're killing a lot of people, women, kids, over what are ultimately non-crimes, right? There's a lot of these crimes have no actual victim, so you're dealing with a crime that is like they're really coming at you with the full force of like the armed federal agency for like a malum prohibitum type crime where no one is actually being victimized. And so most of the ATF's relationship to gun owners has been antagonistic. This is not an agency that has any interest in like actually maintaining or fostering or cultivating like a Second Amendment culture or anything like that. Like this is an example of like a system that is at odds with itself. Like the ATF largely exists, if they could, to just get rid of guns. And the specifically like Democrat administrations, the Obama administration, and now we see the Biden administration uses the ATF to hurt its political enemies very specifically in terms of like guys who want to follow the rules, right? Like the ATF is not super active in Chicago, where if you open TikTok or Twitter or anything like this, you will see groups of inner city teens uh, showing off their Glocks with conversion switches, showing off their handguns when they're like 14, having sometimes open gun battles in the street that end up getting classified as mutual combat. Uh, and so, like, America does, maybe, thread the needle on this, but America does have some degree of gun problem. But the people that the ATF generally targets from like the administrative and institutional level are almost never the people who commit crimes involving firearms that hurt people. They may commit like procedural crimes where the law is made confusing and arbitrary and rapidly changing, and then you catch somebody on the wrong day and they're trying to follow the law and now they've got a federal case. But for the most part, actual gun crime, like everyone knows where this happens, right? And there's not much of a priority made to address that. Conversely, you have people who go to the range on the weekends with their kids or their significant other or their buddies. They go shooting, they do it as a hobby, and they never use these guns to commit armed robberies or carjackings or home invasions or anything like this. This is purely a hobby and like a civic responsibility to be able to defend themselves. And that's who gets victimized by the ATF almost in every case. This is 100% what went on with this pistol brace ban, because the pistol brace thing is already like a concession, right? Like people are already saying, okay, I will comply with the National Firearms Act of 1934 by not just putting a pistol, not just putting a stock on it. So I will buy this cheesy little accessory and I will put it on, my 10-inch AR build, and then I'm okay because the ATF said it's fine. And then even that is not good enough. It's one of those things where if you give an inch, they take the mile. And they do this. They say, well, this is, this is how we, this is like a public health measure, right? I mean, we saw that today. And it's purely antagonistic. The ATF is basically primarily in existence to hurt political enemies of progressive administrations. Like that's largely what it has ever been used for. And it's notably it's not like a prestigious organization. They have not the best reputation. It's not a huge agency. Their number of employees, especially like sworn officers, is not super high, and they have a pretty decent history of like corruption and things like that. And so the agency itself is very dangerous because they are so antagonistic to people who are otherwise just trying to follow the rules. And they do a lot of this. They don't handle any of this through legislation. They handle a lot of these types of rule changes through executive actions, and they issue what's called a final rule. And they use the Administrative Procedure Act to overstep. And then, like I said, they hope it sticks in court. They hope that they don't get their wrist slapped for it. There's no consequences for this armed federal agency to act in bad faith. And so, they're tremendously unpopular because this is an agency that if they have the chance to hurt you, they will hurt you. And primarily their purpose, in effect, like obviously this isn't the stated goal, but if you look at the sum of their actions, it's basically just to hurt middle-class gun owners who want to be left alone.
It's why I think that the ATF is such an interesting case study, because it identifies threads you can see elsewhere, right? The IRS does a lot of similar things, right? Particularly under the Obama admin, when they were going after the Tea Party and going after conservative organizations. But they sort of have this Mont and Bailey where they do that, but also, if you're a local used car dealership and you don't pay your taxes, well, you're going to get a knock on the door from the IRS, right? There's
Right.
kind of it is easier to kind of cloud that, or to kind of couch that as a normal function of government. Whereas with this, it's very clear that the ATF basically just exists to punish red Americans, right? To punish people who are, outside of, the Democratic coalition.
Yeah.
And your point about pistol braces basically being something that only people who care about the law would ever buy is true, right? It's more expensive, it's more inconvenient, it just kind of sucks. But you're like, okay, well, I care about the law. I have a job. I can't afford to, get a lawyer. So, in order to get here, I'll make this compromise. And your point about the things you can see on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, which is a godforsaken platform, is kind of infamous for this, right? Videos of aspiring astrophysicists just like letting
Right.
massive
Yes.
strings of automatic fire
Yeah.
rip in
Yes.
like downtown
Yeah.
Memphis or
Yeah.
something.
Conducting some kinetic experiments with,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. And nothing ever comes from that. And there are these kind of preposterous, elaborate setup situations that you'll hear about. There was recently a guy, and I cannot remember where he was from, but the ATF basically entrapped him. They started asking him like, "Oh, can you do this? Can you do this?" And they basically got him to do something. Combine two things that are individually legal, but as a
Yeah.
combination, it becomes a serious felony. And bang, the officers run out of the woods. We got it. We solved the problem.
Yeah.
And
And sorry,
sorry,
go
carry
ahead.
on. No, that was the end of that anecdote.
Well, the ATF is actually pretty notorious for that type of behavior. Like they've been caught several times conducting like things that would not pass muster in any like serious society. I mean, they've had problems using people who are like mentally retarded as like you know confidential informants. Um, they they had this doctrine for a while that where they would entrap people to commit a crime. Like they would conspire. They would get this person's basically a verbal buy-in where they say, yeah, sure, I'll be there, I'll help out for things that didn't even exist. Right? They got caught. They were making up drug dealers. They were making up plans that did not exist. They would take people who were like recent inmates and say, hey, if you want to make some quick cash, meet me, wherever. I'll give you a gun. We'll go rob this guy's house. He's a drug dealer. And your cut will be, whatever, $5,000 or something like that. And then when that guy shows up, they charge him. They would charge him with like armed robbery, like all these things that would put these guys in jail for life, basically. And this is someone who never even actually touched a gun. They were just like, yeah, okay, I'll be there. And so this wasn't popular with the courts. They do a lot of this type of stuff. They prosecute people for it's called constructive possession, where like if you have two separate items that are not necessarily like assembled or something like that, they will just say, well, the intent is there, so we're going to call this a machine gun, or we're going to call this a firearm, or something like that. And this is kind of what they're known for at like the criminal enforcement level. They've also really increased pressure on FFLs under the Biden administration. Like the number of like license revocations is very high now compared to what it has been in the past, and a lot of it
Can
is for
before you get into that, can you
sure,
define that term FFL? Because I know what that means, but people without, our shared special interest might not.
sure. So an FFL is a federal firearms license. Anyone who engages in the commerce of firearms uh, needs to have an FFL, and I don't know if we'll have time to get into it. That's kind of a loaded term anyway, because they recently attempted to uh, kind of implement universal background checks by saying that anyone who sells a gun where profit is the main driving like factor needs an FFL, which means that like if you've got a gun in your safe and uh, you know maybe you bought it for $500 10 years ago and today it's worth $800, and so you sell it to your buddy for $800, they would say that you need a federal firearms license for that because you're doing this primarily for profit. In the past, they said this has to be basically your primary source of income. The term they use is livelihood, but they've recently tried to strip that. That's kind of a digression. So, an FFL is a federal firearms license. This is what you need to open a gun store. This is what you need, to have access to the federal background check system for firearms purchases. It's called NICS. It's the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. FFLs have to use the NICS system to approve every transaction that they do involving a firearm. Meaning that's why when you walk into a gun store in most states, you fill out the ATF form 4473. They run a NICS check. If your NICS check is approved, you take the firearm home. Uh, Same day in some places, with a waiting period in some places. It depends on whether you have a carry permit and things like that in a lot of states. But they've begun revocations of these FFLs at a much higher rate than they used to in the past for what are clerical errors, right? We're not talking about like they call them rogue gun dealers, right? They will say, okay, this is a rogue gun dealer because they're not following the procedures outlined in the Gun Control Act, like I had mentioned earlier. All gun stores have to comply with at least the Gun Control Act and the National Firearms Act. To exist at the federal level. Each state has its own set of laws as well on top of that, and a lot of municipalities have their own set of laws on top of that. So running a gun store is not, from a legal standpoint, it's not the simplest business that you can run. And a lot of them are run by just regular guys who are not attorneys, who do not have unlimited resources. Like your average mom and pop gun store is not making that much money. And so when the ATF shows up and they do what's called a compliance inspection, which is something that all FFLs are subject to at any point. So the ATF, they will send what's called an IOI, which is an industry operations investigator. They'll send an IOI to your gun store, and they'll do an impromptu audit of your procedures to make sure you're complying with the Gun Control Act. And they do an inventory of your firearms. They check your bound books to make sure that what you say you have, you actually have. They look through your Form 4473s to make sure that all the boxes are checked, all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted, all the NICS numbers are approvals, things like this. And there's a natural rate of failure with this because it's a system. No system's perfect. There's going to be an organic rate of failure. But B, some of the stuff is complex. And when you have these big surges in gun purchases, like anytime that it looks like a Democrat's going to get elected, anytime that there's a serious mass shooting, anytime that there's like a COVID situation or a George Floyd situation, these gun stores get overwhelmed by new customers, and inevitably they forget to check a box here, or they forget to check a box there, or something like that. It's not due to any malice, but the number of revocations due to things like that is way up. Like there's been a couple cases in the news in the last year or two where they've come to people and said, "Hey, guess what, bud? We're taking your license." And at the end, we're going to say that you're, violating the procedures outlined in the GCA, and so your FFL is ours now. So game over. That's it. And this is a very difficult thing to appeal. This usually requires some type of support from an attorney. It requires an ATF regional director to look at this, and ultimately it's like a director level decision to reverse a revocation, and they're not going to do that. Like no one in the ATF under the Biden administration is going to say, "Oh, hey, we're sorry about that, red state grandpa. Here's your FFL back." It just doesn't happen. And so they go around, and a lot of times they put small gun stores out of business because the gun stores don't have the means to really fight back. They just don't have the finances, and they can't afford to be out of business for any length of time. And you see this type of stuff with like binary triggers, force reset triggers. The Polymer 80 gets hit all the time. Blackhawk, there's the whole Vanderstock situation. There's a bunch of examples where the ATF can come in and really press their thumb on you and say, "Hey, you can't earn any income. Like your income stream stops now, and every day that you fight back against this, your stakes get higher because these are going to be. If we say that this is a crime, you can go to jail." So there's a really big asymmetry between federal power and the little guy, so to speak, with regards to the ATF. That this nominally exists in a lot of industries, but it's not as bad as it is with mom and pop gun stores and the ATF. It's a particularly bad disparity.
So you mentioned a few terms there, right? You mentioned the FRT, and this sort of connects to one of the other main court cases that's been in the news, right? And that is, the infamous bump stock.
Yeah.
So can you explain what that is, the kind of legal status of that item, and then the situation we find ourselves in currently.
Yeah, so a bump stock. Um, well, I guess I should explain what bump firing is first. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing, but bump firing a rifle, or any gun really, but mainly rifles, is this is where you take a semi-automatic firearm. That a semi-automatic means that you pull the trigger and it fires one time when you pull the trigger, and it'll fire as fast as you can pull the trigger. And so if you hold the rifle a certain way, like if you tuck your thumb into your belt loop on your pants and you hold the rifle at your hip, you can basically keep your finger rigid and press forward on the rifle. When it fires, it will kick back for a second and then it will spring forward again because you're pulling it forward with your offhand. And then your trigger will kind of automatically hit the trigger and depress it. Okay. This is a way of mimicking, the rate of fire of like a full auto. It lets you fire more rapidly than what you would be able to fire unassisted, basically.
It's basically a party trick, right? It's
Yeah,
not in
it
any
is.
way
Yeah,
effective. It's just something you do with your friends to have fun.
correct. Yeah, it's basically, yeah, a party trick is the right way to describe it because it serves no practical purpose. You would not use this in basically any actual situation where you're facing a threat or something like that because most of the time you're not able to take aimed fire with it anyway. So the bump stock is it's an accessory that replaces, like on an AR-15, it replaces your standard butt stock and it slides over the receiver extension, and your buffer tube, and so it mounts to the gun, and it has a little rest for your trigger finger, and you basically do the same thing, which is you fire the gun, you keep your finger rigid, and the firearm reciprocates in the slide, or in the bump stock. I'm sorry. So it will recoil, slide back forward. Your finger is held in place. So basically, what you're doing is instead of hitting the trigger with your finger, you're hitting your finger with the trigger, and you're just using a little bit of physics to help you out with this. These accessories, these are kind of ubiquitous, and for a long time, they've been totally legal. Because, like you said, this is kind of a party trick thing. The ATF has assessed bump stocks. They've, said, hey, this is not a machine gun, for years, repeatedly. So these were sold at every gun store from, North Carolina to California, and maybe not California. I'm not sure about California, but this is like a corny accessory. Okay, I'm sorry. I think they're kind of corny. So, nonetheless, it's just a gun accessory. It's not actually a big deal. And they were not a big deal until the shooting in Las Vegas. Okay, this was always something that was viewed as just, like I said, kind of a corny accessory, until a team of Mossad agents with several M240 Bravo machine guns opened. No, I'm kidding. I know you can't say that on YouTube.
Well, I will not be editing this. I cannot be bothered to edit a single damn thing out of this podcast. So it's going up on YouTube one way or another.
So until one guy with no motive killed like 58 people and injured 500 something people with
You know what's the weirdest part? That with no motive, his house burned itself down.
That's weird too.
Afterwards. Yeah, for no motive.
These things are tricky. So a lot of people died, and a lot of people, for all legal purposes, were killed by bump stocks, or killed by rifles that had bump stocks on them. Daniel Defense rifles, which seems to be a recurring theme for whatever reason. But no further comment on that. Do not research. But so after that, everyone woke up one morning and was like, holy shit, like, 600 people got shot from the Mandalay Bay Hotel, which is an overrated hotel, by the way. And so they said, well, you got to do something about this. This is crazy. I can't believe
Lee, overrated for what purpose?
Yeah, right. Touche. Yeah. I just gambled when I was there, so I guess it's good for other things. Great view.
Well, let me
Yeah.
tell you, the Arc of Fire from the 31st floor.
Right. Yeah. Uh, so basically, the Trump administration said, okay, well, we got to get rid of these bump stocks because this is crazy. Like, it's crazy that someone would, you know, be able to do this. And so the ATF made a rule. They said, okay, this is a machine gun, so you gotta throw these in the trash. The end. And here's one thing where this is different from the pistol brace thing. Machine guns, you can't introduce new machine guns to private gun ownership, like the commercial market, after 1986. So obviously, new machine guns get made every day, but they get issued to like law enforcement, military, dealer samples for FFLs. But you, like, if you said, "Hey, I want to buy a machine gun. I want to buy a full auto," which is legal. It's just expensive. You would have to source a machine gun that was manufactured, you know, before 1986. And so this is why they're so expensive. This is why people pay 20, 30, 40, 50, $60,000 for machine guns. It's not because the gun is itself is worth $50,000. It's worth arguably as much as any BCM rifle or something. It's just that there's tremendous scarcity because new ones can't be transferred to private ownership. And so if all of a sudden your bump stock becomes a machine gun, you have no way of maintaining ownership of that because it cannot become registered after 1986. And so it kind of forces like a null set where it's like, okay, you would just have to throw this in the trash. And you might say, well, this, you said it was legal. I've spent my own money on this. I'm otherwise allowed to own a firearm. Now you're telling me I have to take this thing that I have purchased with my own money and throw it in the trash or go to jail. And this change has been made not by an elected representative, not by Congress, but by basically a faceless bureaucrat somewhere in the Department of Justice. Like, so uh, basically, this is bullshit. And so a guy named Michael Cargill viewed it that way and said, hey, this is bullshit. And so he surrendered 2 bump stocks to law enforcement and then filed a lawsuit. Now, like I kind of hinted and touched on earlier, this stuff is all, none of this is Second Amendment stuff. The pistol brace thing, the bump stock thing, none of this is a Second Amendment argument. These cases don't go and get decided on Second Amendment grounds. Okay, so this is an important distinction. These get shot down under the Administrative Procedure Act, which is, you know, a totally separate thing. So sometimes people say like, yeah, it's a big win for the Second Amendment. None of that, you know, has to do with the Second Amendment. Like, this did not get thrown out at the Supreme Court because of a Second Amendment argument. The APA is basically the framework that was put in place after World War II for administrative agencies to make regulations. Okay, so there is a certain amount of sovereignty that, for lack of a better term, the federal agencies have, where Congress writes laws, but then agencies have to enforce those laws, and sometimes it becomes necessary to make definitions on things, have procedures for enforcing these laws, ways of interpreting things that maybe were slightly unclear, you know, or perhaps have evolved over time. And so federal agencies have usually a little bit of leeway where they can just kind of say, well, we're the experts on this, and so we get to decide how we're going to define this. This is usually called the Chevron deference, okay, which, you know, this stems back to the 80s where it was like I forget the specifics, but it was an environmental case, and so they said, okay, well, who would know better, like in the absence of clarity, who would know better about something than the agencies that are supposedly experts about these topics, right? You would defer to the ATF about guns because, of course, the ATF knows so much about guns. You would defer to the EPA about environmental matters because they're the EPA, so who better? And so this allows this nightmarish hellscape of rule by theater kids who are pretending to be experts, right? Like, and this, we've seen this. This is an everyday talking point on right wing Twitter because it's true. Like, this is something that we saw this with COVID, right? Like, who was actually an expert on COVID? Not very many people, and the people that were actual experts about COVID were basically forced to exit society for a period of time because they were right and everyone else was wrong. And so the ATF enjoys kind of flexing this a little bit, where they make these rules under the Administrative Procedure Act. They anticipate that maybe the courts will give them some type of Chevron deference, and a lot of times they do. And the current Supreme Court is not postured to support that. And so what you run into is people saying that like the Supreme Court in its current configuration of justices is the extreme court. This is an activist court, right? You've seen liberals screeching about this on Twitter where they say that, wow, Clarence Thomas is, he's like Black Hitler, and he's an extremist just doing, Orange Man's bidding. And in reality, what Clarence Thomas is doing is basically the closest thing to the right thing that a Supreme Court justice could do, which is actually look at the law the way that it's written and closely stick to that. Okay, so this decision with the bump stocks was not actually like an extremist ruling. It was not a pro 2A ruling. It was not an activist ruling. It was nothing of the sort. It was actually a very solid opinion. And it was based strictly on the actual legal definition of a machine gun. Okay, so for the crowd, a machine gun, and I'm going to quote briefly from the opinion, is, quote, any weapon which shoots, is designed to shoot, or can be readily restored to shoot automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. That's the end of the quote. So if you have a rifle with a bump stock on it, it does not do that. It does not shoot more than one shot with a single function of the trigger. It does not. In fact, that's the whole thing of bump stocks. That's the entire gimmick, is that you hold your finger a certain way so that it hits the trigger each time the gun fires. It just does that really fast. So there is no good faith argument to say that a bump stock is a machine gun under the current letter of the law, because it's not. Just at face value, it's not. There is no way that a bump stock actually falls into that definition. You could have the philosophical argument and just say, well, any gun that shoots really fast is a machine gun. And, perhaps there's some understandable level of, like, maybe I could see why someone would think that, right? Like, if we're being fair about it, I could understand why a gun that sounds just like a machine gun, a lay person like Sonia Sotomayor might just say, well, that's a machine gun. And in this case, that's exactly what she did. And she came up with this really corny like example about a duck, right? Like, Clarence Thomas, this was a 6-3 decision. Thomas and the people that you would expect said, hey, look, I'm sorry, but the lower court is right. The lower court had already ruled that bump stocks are not machine guns. The Fifth Circuit had already said that. The Supreme Court, all they did was affirm it. So this wasn't like a big reversal. They just said, hey, yeah, sorry, this other court got it right, which is another thing that people don't like to say. They just want to blast the Supreme Court because they have an ulterior motive. But Sotomayor came out and said, and I'm going to quote her dissent here. She said, when I see a bird that walks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, I call that bird a duck. A bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle fires automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger, end quote. So from a factual standpoint, she's wrong. It doesn't do that. That's the entire thing. Like, that's the whole gimmick of a bump stock, is that you pull the trigger a bunch of times in a very short succession. So that's how it shoots quickly, is that it lets you pull the trigger a bunch of individual times much more quickly than you would otherwise be able to do. So just at face value, it doesn't do it. It just does not hold up. But beyond that, what she's doing here is taking a stab at like, uh, what a Zoomer would call like just following the vibes, where it's like, well, I don't know, I don't care. It sounds fast, and so I'm just gonna say it's a machine gun because I'm a wise Latina woman from the Bronx who can make a better decision than Neil Gorsuch or somebody by merit of the fact that whatever I lived in public housing, and so what this kind of reveals is this is like a war never changes thing where this problem has always existed where you have an institutional class which at this point in American society is people like Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor and Kataji Jackson or whatever her name is. These are people who are inept. They're hired not on any type of merit. A lot of them are just dumb. But for whatever reason, which there are plenty, these are the people that people look up to, right? People will say, that somewhere an overweight woman who works in HR read this and snapped her fingers and did a little head nod and was like, "You go, girl," uh, because Sonia Sotomayor made up some bullshit that's factually not true, and then 100% irresponsible. You're a Supreme Court justice. If I want someone to say, well, if I see a bird that looks like a duck, I'm just going to call it a duck. That's not the type of decision making or framework for thought that you would say, wow, I got to get this person to the Supreme Court like right away. This person is a real fucking philosopher here, and this the smartest person in the room by far. This is retarded, and so it's like it's both dumb and condescending because it makes it obvious that she has no interest in considering the actual facts of the case. Like that's clear. Not only has she rejected the prospect of even considering this in good faith, but she's just brushing it off and saying, I don't care. I'm a Supreme Court justice, so I'm just going to call it like this. And this is a thing that has existed. Basically, I mean, you could take this back to like the 12 tables of Rome, where it's like, okay, we're going to have a plebeian revolt because the laws, you need to write these down, you need to etch them in stone, you need to post them in public where people can see it. That way, the patrician class can't just change the rules whenever they feel like it, or things like this. So this is a frustrating dissent. It's good that it's a dissent. It's good that they didn't win, but it's frustrating because at face value it's corrupt. It's like the three chicks here didn't even try. They just said, we don't like these guns. They're scary. They're mean. A duck is a duck. I don't care. I'm dissenting. There's no effort at actual good faith jurisprudence on this, which is alarming. Again, it's a good thing that it lost, but it's bad that this is the situation we're in, and this is going to continue. It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, it's very clear, right, that even the kind of thin veneer of impartiality, at least having the decency to present this as an issue where you weighed both sides is just completely and totally gone. It's just kind of naked power politics. And I think in a bigger picture context, it's interesting as we kind of look at the Supreme Court as from a certain perspective, right, the kind of seat of at least on certain issues, kind of ultimate sovereignty, because the Supreme Court handed the cultural left a sort of epic series of wins, right? Like a very consistent way to get exactly what they wanted. You could go back to Obergefell, pick your poison, right?
Right.
And now that I won't even say the shoe is on the other foot, but it's a more contentious kind of organ of power. Well, all of a sudden, the slings and arrows come out, right? All of a sudden, it's fascistic. It's fascistic. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's racist. It's the legacy of slaveholders. Again, kind of, you can kind of play Mad Libs with this, right? And I guarantee you, there's a Daily Beast article that has basically that same headline.
Right. Yeah.
But nonetheless, right, it is interesting to kind of watch some of these issues that have been kind of like open fissures in American politics kind of get actually addressed, right? Like obviously abortion still exists, but Roe versus Wade is gone. We're kind of seeing some of these Second Amendment kind of definitive questions answered. And so I think that kind of looking into the near future, it's an interesting position because a lot of the things that were just kind of always these kind of roiling issues, well, those, even if they aren't being solved, we're at least seeing a decision being made either way, which I guess is kind of is an interesting point. But so do you have anything to add on that point?
No, I mean I agree. It's there's arguably no more luxury than knowing what the rules are. So it is probably good from that point, even if only from like maybe an accelerationist standpoint or something, where it's like, okay, now that we're marking these cases one way or another, we can progress to whatever the next thing is going to be.
And I think that that very much is, kind of the feeling of something else coming next. And, I've been made fun of before for kind of bringing my gun autism onto a, relatively serious podcast where not everyone is kind of as technically interested as you and I might be. But I think that the reason that I'm continually interested in talking about the ATF is that they're sort of the perfect crystallization of all of the issues we have with an unaccountable, politicized bureaucracy, right? A collection of regulatory agencies that basically exist exclusively to punish the enemies of power, right? This does not make us measurably safer. It doesn't make your life better that your neighbor got thrown in jail over a procedural violation, but it is useful for kind of the power, right? It is useful for the total state, whatever you want to call it. And so I think it's interesting, or it's important for even people who aren't hobbyists, who may not even live in America, to understand these issues because it's sort of a perfect encapsulation of trends we can observe elsewhere.
Yeah, it is, and it also shows their full measure of commitment to like nothing is ever going to be good enough, right? Like if you comply with one thing, they're going to change that 5 to 10 years down the road, and it's a one way ratchet. It's not never going to get any looser, and these things like the Supreme Court, these types of decisions. I think the left looks at this and they say, "Wow, these guys are extremists. This is insane. I can't believe they would do this." Because to them, it's almost like a quaint kind of anachronism that someone would actually read the law and care what it says, and say that you got to stick to it. Like that's they're all well past that. That's like that's not so that's a low status belief to the left that the rules would apply to them, or that someone would expect some type of equal representation under the rules or something like that. Like things that for a long time in America were considered to be kind of foundational ideas that, guns are good, going to church is fine, free speech is cool, all these things. The idea that this could be protected somehow using institutional power is the opposite of what the left believes. And this thing like this, the bump stock thing in the Supreme Court, is like it's good that it's a win, and I don't mean to counter signal it, but in a way that like the dissent on it shows how dangerous the thinking is because. If you think about this a certain way, Sotomayor's response to this is a lot more of like a Giga Chad than Clarence Thomas's. Right? She's just saying, "Yeah, I don't care what the law says. Fucking get rid of these things. You guys are retards." Clarence Thomas is the one saying, "Well, it says here, according to this thing that was written in 1934, that technically your finger does touch the trigger." You know what I mean? Like, this is a pedantic thing to win at, and you're on the wrong side if you're already winning that way, right? Like the only reason that this went this way is because Trump did a good job of getting Supreme Court justices onto the bench. Uh, it's very clear that some of the members of the Supreme Court are just ruling based off of whatever the most progressive, bullshit is. And so there is power there. And right now, there are more nominally right wing justices than left. But it's like I said, it's not going to stay that way. And these people are only going to, uh, continue to give runway to these federal agencies that exist just to punish people. I mean, that's all that it is. You look at even like the FBI with these prosecutions of people who like pray outside of abortion clinics and things like that. I mean, there's like old ladies who are going to die in jail because they're trying to stop young women from killing their kids. Uh, like that's a ridiculous thing to have in any country, but especially in a country where we don't punish violent crime. Like you're telling me that we do live in a country where you could go into a Walgreens and steal $900 worth of shit in broad daylight and walk out without even covering your face with no fear that anyone would even think to stop you. But if you tell someone, hey, maybe think twice about killing your child, you will regret this, then, guys in a tank show up with body armor and hop out and fucking put you in a cage until you die. Uh, this is where this leads, and like it feels good to them because they're the ones in power. But this is a dumb way of doing business. In the long term, it's 100% unsustainable.
So, Lee, we are fast approaching time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot. But if people want to find more of your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, if you want to follow the gun stuff, it's enblockpress.com, ENBLOC press.com. It's a newsletter and occasional podcast, mostly, like I said, focusing on guns, politics, 3D printing. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at shortmagsmle. And that's mostly non-serious shit posting with that type of thing.
I will just add a personal endorsement. Lee's Twitter account is genuinely hilarious. He has probably the highest hit percentage of any shit poster on Twitter. So highly recommend that. And again, man, thanks for coming out.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. I actually do get a decent number of people requesting to sponsor my show, and I only have one sponsor because there's only one company that has ever sent me an actual pitch that was good, and that was JD at Axios. We're friends. I like his stuff. I use it 4 times a week. It's a solid programming app. Highly recommend it. So check that out. And again, guys, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.